More strategy games are becoming multiplayer, and world tension is rising. Alliances have never been more important, so today we're going to see how they work in real life compared to games. The games we'll be looking at are in the multiplayer nation sim genre because they focus exclusively on diplomacy. We'll be looking at a number of alliances that are important today. Each of them has a unique set of circumstances and challenges which are similar to those faced by players. Let's start with ASEAN. It's a political and economic bloc located in Southeast Asia. There are two important elements of the bloc that interest players. Firstly, its economic position, and secondly, its location. We don't typically think of alliances being economic, but most of them are. Southeast Asia is filled with countries that are growing very quickly, and collectively they have a lot of bargaining power, but individually they are a lot less powerful. For instance, ASEAN's collective GDP is $4 trillion. Collectively, they're equal to Germany, but individually, it's more like Ireland or Morocco. In the game Politics and War, there is a similar alliance called Pentaforce. It's filled with smaller countries that want to remain independent, avoid wars, and catch up to the competition. Individually, they're almost useless, but collectively, they're unequal to some of the strongest countries in the game. The second element is ASEAN's location. It controls vital trade routes and is surrounded by powerful countries. Australia to the south, the US to the east, China to the north, and India to the west. There's nothing like this in Politics and War and most other games, because countries are mostly self-sustaining. Cutting off a trade route and ruining someone's game would be a bold decision for any developer. However, there are always players squished between two giants that either want them as an ally or a vassal. Pentaforce is in this situation too, and although it's quieter than ASEAN, it pursues the same strategy, cooperating with both and using their status as the most eligible bachelor to get as much as possible. The next alliance is the Warsaw Pact. It might seem strange that I'm including a bloc that disbanded, but you need to remember how important it was. The Warsaw Pact controlled most of Eastern Europe and almost half of Asia, directly and indirectly. More has been said about this alliance than any other except NATO. Players are interested in this alliance for all sorts of reasons. However, the two most important elements are its balancing and informal empire. The Warsaw Pact was a rival to NATO, and they both balanced against each other by trying to get more countries and weapons. As they both grew in power, the world entered a period of bipolarity, where most of the world's military power was concentrated in only two blocs. This happens very frequently in PNW because small countries want security, and they naturally seek out strong allies. However, in games these small countries aren't included in the bloc and given full voting rights. Instead, they receive bilateral treaties with one or more members of the bloc, and get called peripherals in their sphere of influence. In real life, being told you're a peripheral or in a sphere of influence is somewhat of an insult, as it implies a lack of agency and that you're a puppet. The countries within the Warsaw Pact were also restricted from learning about life in NATO countries. This may seem impossible to replicate in games, but it is surprisingly easy and common. In games, players are often told not to read what their opponents write or talk to enemy players. Alliances in games will even create their own news reports to control the narrative, just like state-owned media. The other element I mentioned was informal empire. The Warsaw Pact was extremely influential and integrated with dozens of informal member states that were influenced through economic or military assistance. And the countries within the bloc were beholden to the USSR, which exerted almost imperial control over their resources and populations. In Politics and War, the largest countries use similar tactics to control their allies. They debt trap them or integrate them to such a large extent that they can never leave without severe losses. The next alliance is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. It's a massive military coalition led by the United States and made up of countries in Europe and North America. It was originally designed to stop the growing influence of the USSR and defend Europe against Soviet invasion. After the USSR fell, it became the world's most powerful military bloc. NATO is the inspiration for many of the blocs in PNW, and its collective security guarantee called Article 5 is present in every bloc treaty. However, there are some quirks or developments to this article in the game. Some blocs include supremacy clauses, which mean that their commitment to the bloc takes priority over all others. Alternatively, they can sign non-chaining clauses, which limit the collective security guarantee to those in the bloc. If one of the parties is dragged into a war because of another treaty, then the rest don't need to defend them. Finally, some people argue that collective security should only apply at a certain scale. They will defend all their allies against small threats, but if the threat is too big, then they will not, or vice versa. For a direct comparison in PNW, it would be Whelp. Eclipse is the largest member country, and all the others depend on it for security and power projection, because they have the biggest and baddest players. This is comparable to the US and its military power, which dwarfs the other allies in NATO. The next alliance is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a mouthful, so we can call it OPEC. Their Wikipedia page calls them a cartel, which isn't entirely inaccurate, since they control most of the world's oil and use it strategically. A similar thing occurs in games where there's a monopoly over a necessary resource. In EVE Online, the Goon Swarm literally created OTEC. They were not hiding their inspiration at all. In Politics&War, the cartels are more secretive. Food is a resource everyone needs, but only the oldest and richest countries produce it. These groups, including Grumpy and Guardian, create artificial scarcity, raise prices to disadvantage opponents, and try to prolong their dominance for as long as possible. However, they are also keenly aware this will eventually end. In real life, the OPEC countries plan to modernize and move away from their dependence, but in games there is no backup plan. In real life, people focus on the long term, but in games it's all about the player's experience and their short-term goals. Another thing worth noting is that in games, those older players can pressure the developers into maintaining their monopolies, or creating new ones, whereas in real life, it is more chaotic. Saudi Arabia probably cannot appeal to the divine to generate resources. The next alliance is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The Quad is a military alliance composed of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. It's arguably designed to contain China or to protect supply chains. Containment is extremely common in games with a map. Civilization and Stellaris are famous for it, because you only need to place a city or take a system to prevent a rival from growing. Real life is a bit different, because unlike those games, real countries aren't colonial empires. Most of the time. But the principle is the same. By surrounding China, they can limit its global reach and counter any military actions if necessary. But wait, where does the US come in? They are an ocean away from China. How can they contain it? Well, the US might be practicing offshore balancing. This means they're supporting the countries that neighbor China and can contain it. If the US did nothing, then the countries trying to contain China may fail, and then China would become even stronger than the US. Politics&War doesn't have a map, so traditional containment doesn't work. Countries can't just place a city and stop their rival from growing. So instead, the oldest countries engage heavily in offshore balancing. Every new country in the game is basically forced to, or paid to, fight other new countries. This slows down the growth of all new countries and makes the older ones safer. The next alliance is BRICS. It's a political and economic organization that is composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as 4 recent additions. BRICS is commonly described as a rising power with the world's leading economies and most of the world's population. It opposes the US dollar and promotes multipolarity. Everyone that's played a game will be familiar with this concept, but probably not the word. Multipolarity is when lots of different countries or alliances are powerful, and none of them can conquer the world alone. In short, they don't want someone to win the game. Coalitions like BRICS take time to develop in real life, but in games they usually happen quickly and end as soon as the threat is handled. Unlike real life, a war is not stigmatized in games, and it's much easier to measure the strength of rivals. So the coalition rides out to defeat the opponent, divide up the spoils of war, and return home, until eventually they lose and someone conquers the world. In almost every game, someone eventually wins. I will also address another element of BRICS which isn't addressed in games. BRICS wants to reshape international institutions to better reflect their relative power. For example, India wants to be on the UN Security Council. Only the most powerful countries in the world are permanent members of the council. France and the UK are on this council, but India is not, and that seems unfair. The real reason India isn't on the council is because it was created a long time ago. Trying to change how the council works is difficult, because the people on it have institutional power and incentive to keep them off. This type of institutional power is absent from games. Sometimes player organizations can influence developers, but this is rarely a big problem. Because there are no institutions, then it is very easy for countries in Politics and War, or other games, to change the informal rules created by players. There's no advantage to treating another country as more or less powerful than they actually are. In conclusion, alliances in games can replicate real alliances like NATO, but with different circumstances. There will always be a difference, big or small. And often this takes the form of underlying principles, such as war being a positive in games since it creates content. Thanks for watching, and why not watch another video?